Okay, so I'd like to introduce some basic ideas about color theory and give you a few examples of some art historical examples of how artists have used color. The examples I'm giving today are from a textbook that uses ink as its examples. Pigment, if you were using acrylic or oil, would be slightly different. Every manufacturer is going to have a slightly different color red. Um, and so every medium is going to be slightly different. But in theory, we're not going to be talking about how light works today, and we're going to be talking about how pigment works. If you remember from your science classes, um, in light, all colors, split with a prism, produce when they all come back together, they produce white light. In pigment, you mix all colors, and you, in theory, get black, or in practice, you'll notice in the center here, you get this kind of dark neutralized gray. In this diagram, it's a primary triad. You see the primary colors, yellow, blue, and red, connected by the solid line of the triangle. And secondary colors are produced when you mix the two primary colors, yellow, blue, produce the green, the blue, red produce violet, and red and yellow produce orange. Those are connected with the dotted lines. Okay. Um, the other concept that I want to mention, which we'll look at in a couple different images, but complementary colors would be any color opposite on the color wheel. So yellow being the color with the value closest to white, excuse me, purple being the color that's darkest and closest to black in value is at the bottom. So that's the upper and lower part of the color wheel. They're opposite each other. You mix them together, you should get some sort of neutralized gray. Red and green, orange and blue, yellow and purple are complementary colors. When you put those colors next to each other, say a blue next to an orange, you're going to get a simultaneous contrast, a super high contrast, and the color is going to vibrate. One basic idea would be during the Renaissance, artists would do underpainting. In oil paints, they would underpaint in like a burnt umber or a raw sienna. These earth tone colors were the original underpainting, and then other colors were glazed on top. Um, at the Impressionist, the post-Impressionists and the Impressionists, a lot of color theory, scientific color theory, played into how artists painted and used color, as well as new kind of man-made pigments. And if you say get to I don't know, you go to the Art Institute and look at some Impressionist paintings. I hope you all get a chance to do that. You can notice when you're looking at the painting, the blue sky would most likely be underpainted in orange and then glazed over with the blues of the sky. And then sometimes you'll see little edges of the blue, little edges of the orange creeping out where, say, the sky meets the horizon line. And that contrast, the juxtaposition of the little sliver of orange next to the blue makes that orange even more bright and more intense. So we have the basic primary colors, the basic secondary colors, and then we have intermediate colors where you could mix those together in even proportions, and you should also get a kind of neutralized gray. In this example, you can see the primary, secondary, and intermediate hues. Basically, the color wheel is fleshed out, and as you get into the smaller inner circles, those tertiary hues, those colors are kind of neutralized as they go closer and closer to that center gray, which is completely neutralized. We were looking at values previously in class, going from white to black. We discussed high key and low key values. in the center of this diagram, you can see that white at the top and black at the bottom. There's a horizontal dotted line that sort of separates high key and low key colors. We have cool colors on the right, warm colors on the left. We discussed that a little bit previously, the idea that cool colors would recede when we were talking about perspective, linear perspective. We also had a brief discussion about atmospheric perspective, how when you look at a mountain in the distance it might be a little hazy and might be blues and grays and that might recede. How you might have oranges and reds and like a desert scene in the foreground, and those warm colors push forward and the cool colors recede back. And to think about just one color, as well as the value scale, white at the top, black at the bottom. On the left we have a red. And as you mix white with that color, you go from red towards white, you would end up with a tint or this kind of pink color. And when you mix black with that color, you would end up with a shade of red, a darker color, and then a more medium neutral color here. So that intensity of that color changes. The color is lowered in intensity as the value gets lighter. So I'd like to show a few art historical examples. This is Paul Cézanne, 1875, oil on canvas. I want you to notice in particular the brush strokes and the change of color. How basically Cézanne is modeling form through the use of colors. There are these warm colors on the apples that push forward, and then on the edges of those apples, the cool colors, the cool colors along the edges would recede backward into space. So it's a shallow space, but he's using warm and cool colors as well as the direction of the brush strokes itself to create that volume and to use color use color to help create that form. This Gauguin painting from 1891 is interesting because he's actually compressing space through the use of color. He flattens that space. There are cool blues and blue violets and sort of a neutral red surrounded by some dark green colors, right, which push forward, which push the foreground, which push the foreground backward. The warm yellows and yellow greens pull that background forward. So basically, he's flattening that pictorial space, right? The green pushes the foreground back. The warm yellows, yellow greens pull the background forward. So this sort of color is pushing forward. The warm yellows throughout the painting there. It really, along with even these sort of lines, we were discussing perspective previously, help create that three-dimensional space, but the color flattens that space. Okay. This Monet painting, 1903, he's capturing this sort of architecture, this architectural form of this bridge, the Waterloo Bridge. He's giving up and sacrificing detail of the architecture in order to capture that effect of sunlight. The colors produce this sort of atmospheric effect. And again, giving up the detail for the use of that color. You got these yellows, the complementary colors, we could think about those. The purples here, the yellows there. There's various oranges and blues. So think about how he's using cool colors to recede, say under the arches of the bridge. And the warm yellows, a little bit of reds and oranges up on the edge of the bridge, push forward. Wolf Kahn. Here's a painting from 1995. He's known for, especially in his later work, for this sort of extreme use of color. It's kind of a personal joy that he finds in painting with this intense color, these vibrant uses of color. And again, we could think about how just the complementary colors of orange and blue on the color wheel, opposite each other on the color wheel, and think about how the orange of the trees push forward, the blue of the sky pushes backward. And it does this kind of flattening here, where this part in the distance pushes forward. We have purples throughout, complementary colors to the yellow. Here's a Frida Kahlo painting from 1951 using what we would term local color. Local color is color that simulates the hues of the objects as they appear in nature. So compared to the previous painting where the trees were this bright orange, almost like a flame, here Frida Kahlo is using color in a way that is doing that's attempting to describe the actual color of these objects in nature. And we could compare that to this Emil Nolde painting from 1909 as an expressionist, employing these kind of bold clashing colors, right? I mean, in many ways breaking some of the rules of how complementary colors distort space or push forward or pull back into space. Here, it's much more about the emotional response, right? This intense feeling created by using complementary colors or near complementary colors on the color wheel. But this very expressive use of color compared to, say, the Frida Kahlo, the previous image, which was trying to capture the way an object appears. So the important thing about all of these images and a little bit of the theory that I'm talking about today is you can use some of that original theory I talked about as a beginning point, but there's many different ways to use color, whether you're doing local color or an emotional expressive kind of color, or really pushing those complementary colors. I think for our brief introduction to color within this course, those are plenty of things for you to explore, and I would like you to think about how you're going to use that color, and I'll talk about that in more detail in an audio file later on the syllabus today.